You'd think that Japan would have had enough of nuclear power, what with the Fukushima Daiichi disaster still going on 5 years later, and people still testing their food for radiation. But, as reported in the March 10th New York Times and on BeyondNuclear.org's website, people had to sue to get the Takahama nuclear power plants to shut down. The court said that Japanese government nuclear regulatory authority standards are insufficient to protect the public. And I doubt if the timing is a coincidence. The court found in favor of the people of Japan 2 days before the 5th anniversary of the first day of the Fukushima Daiichi disaster. Check out the 1.5-minute YouTube video in English of the celebration of those nukes being shut down. This is Ken Gale, Environment TV, Environmental Weekly News, New York. Mainstream news is not where I generally look for environmental articles. That's why alternative press like Environment TV exists and why it needs to exist. But every once in a while, there is an article on a local environmental issue which has national repercussions, and being in the mainstream helps convince people we should be paying attention. These local stories often get forgotten rather than studied further, such as the article that Luther Termel wrote for the New Haven Register in Connecticut back on July 14, 2012. Animal senses don't necessarily work the way ours do, and it turns out that dogs can hear methane going through a high-pressure pipeline, and it really bothers some breeds. Methane is marketed as natural gas. It's audible to people too and vibrates nearby objects. Some people are naturally going to be more sensitive to those sounds and vibrations than others. These sounds and vibrations are constant, day and night. With more and more pipelines going through heavily populated areas, this is going to be a more and more common problem. Steve Kolhazy, a mechanical engineer in Brookfield, Connecticut, quoted in the article, thinks those vibrations are damaging to the pipe itself, and perhaps that's why pipelines explode so often. Representatives from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission investigated the complaint, but would not comment. And company officials said there was no problem, that the noise is from the operation of the compressor units and is within, quote, strict limits set by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, unquote. Yeah. The pipeline is 3 to 4 feet underground, so imagine how loud it would have to be for someone to hear it when you first walk onto Mr. Kolhazy's backyard. The vibrations are also causing ripples on his above-ground swimming pool, and his dog was placed on Prozac. At the time of the New Haven Register article, the state of Connecticut was trying to increase the use of methane for heating homes. And pipelines are still being built to supply that methane from the fracking fields of Pennsylvania and Ohio, even though that methane is radioactive. Methane is also a greenhouse gas that is 120 times worse than carbon dioxide when it is first emitted. Carbon dioxide is the greenhouse gas that is usually talked about because there is more of it than there is of methane, but methane is increasing rapidly due to the hydraulic fracturing process of extraction. Greenhouse gases are called that because when they're in the atmosphere, they act like the roof of a greenhouse, converting some sunlight into heat and trapping it. That's where the global warming part of climate chaos comes from. Not all greenhouse gases are equal, and global warming isn't the only damage they do. They also acidify land and water and change wind patterns, which changes weather patterns, and that in turn changes climate. There are many YouTube videos explaining the greenhouse effect. I'm Ken Gale for Environment TV's Environmental Weekly News, New York. When I was a young activist, I went to an energy conference that was all weekend long and had an absolutely wonderful time, spending 3 days with 100 people who were intelligent and caring and sensitive and gave a damn about people. It was a wonderful weekend, a wonderful group of people to be with, made a lot of friends. And I tell you, going back to work on Monday was tough because you're going, why can't the whole world be like that? It was a great weekend. And every once in a while, an organization will do a weekend like that. And on April 29th and April 30th, May 1st, the Indian Point Safe Energy Coalition and the Stony Point Convergence are having a weekend like that. They're calling it the Safe Energy Summit, and they're bringing anti-nuclear activists from all over the country together at the Stony Point Center, which is a beautiful place to have it, and way better than like a hotel. It's wooded, it's during bird migration, so there'll be warblers in the trees. The deer there are very, very tame. Wonderful spot. Should be very inspirational, especially with the people who are going to be showing up there. So I urge you all, you want to go to this. April 29, April 30, May 1st, 3-day weekend. And it's going to be at the Stony Point Center, which is in Rockland County, New York, north of New York City. And for more information, go to www.stonypointcenter.org and then click on Get Involved, right? stonypointcenter.org, Get Involved. Co-sponsors include Hudson River Sloop Clearwater, Nuclear Resistor, Dr. Helen Caldecott, WBAI-FM's Ecologic, the New York City Safe Energy Campaign, and Environment TV will also be there. Hope to see you there.
Thank you. This is happening in a larger legal context. The Spectra people are in court. Our Indian Point heroes have decided that they are guilty and proud of it. They're proud of what they're doing, and they very well may do it again because they're doing it for the health and safety of us all. We have now our lawyer. His name is Marty Stolar. And Marty, you want to come down? Stolar. Thank you. Come down and give us a little bit of an overview.
Well, I'm here this afternoon to represent 11 very brave people who took it upon themselves.
This is the mic you want to use.
Who took it upon themselves to stand up and bring to the public's attention that the license for operating the second reactor at Indian Point had expired. That means that Indian Point is now operating with 2 expired reactors. They are not licensed. If any one of us decided to drive an automobile without a license, we'd get locked up. Instead, Indian Point is allowed to continue to operate, and as the 11 brave people who took it upon themselves to bring that to everybody's attention to try to shut down Indian Point and preserve the safety and health of all of us. Their intention today, having been charged with disorderly conduct, is to plead guilty, and to proudly plead guilty for standing up and taking on the responsibility of being responsible citizens and bringing this to the world's attention, that Indian Point needs to be shut down. They will plead guilty, they will be given a slap on the wrist of time served, and they will go on to continue the fight to shut down the plant, the dangerous plant at Indian Point.
Thank you. Thank you, Marty. So Gary, old friend, wonderful person for knowledge and expertise on Indian Point. I'm handing you the microphone.
And 2 minutes will be difficult.
I know.
My name's Gary Shaw. My family and I live about 5.5 miles from the Indian Point nuclear plant. I have been trying to get this plant closed since February of 2000, when Con Edison still owned Indian Point 2. There was a steam pipe rupture. Radioactive steam went into the atmosphere. Radioactive water went into the Hudson River, and I decided I need to know more about this. One of the first things I learned was that in 1979, Robert Ryan, who was in charge of the NRC's Office of State Programs, he was the emergency planner for all the nuclear plants in the country. He testified in front of the Westchester County Board of Legislators, and he said, and I quote, "Indian Point is one of the most inappropriate sites in existence for a nuclear plant," and unquote. And he wrote a letter to the U.S. House of Representatives, and he wrote, quote, "I think it is insane to have a 3-unit reactor on the banks of the Hudson River, 20 miles from the Bronx and 40 miles from Midtown Manhattan. We're now almost," unquote. We're now almost 40 years beyond Mr. Ryan's comments and beyond the 40-year lifespan for which these reactors were designed using 1960s technology. We know that they vent radioactivity as a normal part of their operations. We know that the counties around Indian Point have elevated levels of thyroid cancers that was identified by studying CDC data from the United States. We know, because there have been headlines recently, that there's tritium-laced water leaking into the groundwater. We haven't heard yet, but would not be surprised to be hearing soon, that that water also includes strontium-90 and cesium-137. In 2007, the Journal News reported that fish caught near Indian Point had detectable levels of strontium-90 in their flesh. We know that the spent fuel pools now contain more than 5 times the number of spent fuel assemblies for which they were designed. Specifically, both IP2 and IP3 pools were designed to hold 264 assemblies each. But IP2 has about 1,374 assemblies, and IP3 has about 1,345 assemblies. That I know because I got a letter from an official in the NRC telling me that in response to a specific question I asked. We know that Indian Point is near the intersection of the Ramapo Fault and the Stamford to Peekskill Fault. The Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory estimates that the intersection could have a 7.0 magnitude earthquake. NIC has identified Indian Point 3 as the nuclear plant in the U.S. most likely to suffer reactor core damage from seismic activity. There is not another nuclear plant in the world that has the population density of Indian Point. There are 20 million people within a 50-mile radius who live or work and who are in danger. 50 miles is defined as the peak injury zone by a study that was done by the Sandia National Laboratories for the House of Representatives. This place was a mistake to build in the first place. It's constantly dangerous. It has had multiple unplanned shutdowns and fires, and it's just a nightmare waiting to happen. And the potential consequences of radiologic contamination in the New York metropolitan area is just unacceptable. It's way past its expiration. It should be shut right away. And just to add insult to injury, the very notion that a 42-inch diameter, high-pressure natural gas line is being built right now next to an aged and degraded nuclear plant is a monstrosity. Shut Indian Point, stop the Spectra Algonquin pipeline expansion.
Thank you, Gary.
The Hudson River used to be a place that nobody wanted to live next to because it was so dirty and smelly. No longer true. Now, property values now in the Hudson River are very high. People want to live there. And the biggest reason for that is an environmental group called Friends of Clearwater, started by Pete Seeger, who launched a boat called the Clearwater to get people out on the river, to get people familiar with the river and in love with it and wanting to protect it. And people told them it would never work, and clearly it did because the river is so much cleaner now. That boat was launched, 45 years ago, and the Coast Guard has mandated repairs to the boat to make it seaworthy, and those repairs are going to cost $850,000. Yes, nearly $1 million to make that boat so that the Coast Guard will allow it back on the water. Pete is no longer with us, but his legacy has lived on, and there's going to be a series of concerts up and down the Hudson River to raise that $850,000. And I want to tell you about one of them. April 29th in New York City at the Ethical Culture Center, which is on the corner of 64th Street and Central Park West. The concert is from 7 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. and already there's quite an all-star lineup. Kim and Reggie Harris, the Chapin Sisters, Judy Gorman, Bethany and Rufus, the Ebony Hillbillies, and Bev Grant. As that's just to start with. So come to the concert, keep the Clearwater afloat, and help this great environmental group. It deserves all of our support. April 29th, that's a Friday, 7 to 9:30. I'm Ken Gale for Environment TV's Environmental Weekly News in New York.
We hope that someday, with your help, that we achieve our goal of creating a worldwide environmental communications network with at least one of our divisions broadcasting, streaming, or whatever the method will then be called, to you, thereby giving you the choice of viewing it at your location and at your leisure, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, just like the cable and other television stations you are receiving now. Until then, this is the Environment TV Weekly News.
I saw a great big tourist bus of folks from out of town. For 40 days and 40 nights, they covered miles of ground. They had a map and compass, but they still were not arriving. Oh, they couldn't get to Pleasantville, so they kept on driving. And then one day the sirens blew, the county was aghast. It seems the aging nuke plant had an accident at last. The stockholders who fainted couldn't be reached for reviving. And they couldn't get to Pleasantville because there was no driving. The highways turned to parking lots from Albany to Queens. The politicians learned just what evacuation means. They frantically assembled all their staff for some contriving. But they couldn't get to Pleasantville because there was no driving. They knew the Hudson River was contaminated now. The radiation off the charts of what they could allow. They cursed the leaky nuke plants and its owners for their jiving. But they couldn't get to Pleasantville because there was no driving. The drivers of the buses went to pick up their own kids. School nurses giving KI were about to flip their lids. And somewhere in the distance there were terrorists high-fiving. But they couldn't get to Pleasantville because there was no driving. The parents were hysterical and tried to storm the schools. They didn't give a damn about evacuation rules. The plan went out the window, folks just cared about surviving. And they couldn't get to Pleasantville because there was no driving. They thought of Fukushima and the folks who had to flee. The 50-mile radius set by the NRC. Our own 10-mile escape plan is a relic worth archiving. 40 years of population growth guarantees no driving.